The key my husband cut for me 40-some years ago would not turn in my own front door. I stood on the porch of the house Walter and I built, 2 days after I buried him, jiggling a key that had opened that lock every day of my life, and it simply would not go. Through the window, I could see my daughter-in-law, Carol, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed, watching me try. She did not come to the door. She did not wave. She just watched. The way you watch a stranger who has parked too long in front of your house. My son David appeared behind her, and he had the decency to look at his shoes. Carol slid the window open 3 inches. "Lenora," she said, "we changed the locks. It's better this way. You've got a lot on your plate right now, and David and I think you should be somewhere people can look after you." My name is Lenora Whitaker. Most everybody who knows me calls me Nora. I am 71 years old, and I have lived in Kerrville, Texas, almost my whole life. I raised my children in this hill country town, kept the books for the elementary school down the road for 26 years, and married a good man named Walter when I was 22. I thought I had built something that would hold. Standing on that porch with a dead key in my hand, I understood I had built something they intended to take. Before I tell you the rest, I'd like to know where you're listening from today. Drop your town or your state in the comments. It helps an old woman feel a little less alone telling this. Now let me take you back, because what happened on that porch was not the beginning. The beginning was 2 days earlier, on the morning of the funeral, when I quietly walked out to Walter's workshop and opened his safe before anybody else thought to look. What I found in there is the reason I am at peace today. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you won't understand what they took from me until you understand what I had. Walter and I married in 1975. He ran a little surveying and title research office off Main Street, measured property lines, traced old deeds, sorted out who owned what when the county records got muddy. It was not glamorous work, but Walter loved it. He used to say a man's whole life could come down to whether his name was written correctly on one piece of paper. I did not understand then how much that one sentence would come to mean to me. We bought our place on 4 acres outside town when David was a baby. It needed everything. Walter rewired it himself on weekends, with a flashlight in his teeth. And I painted every room twice, because I could never get the color right the first time. There's a yellow in the kitchen I picked 3 times before I gave up and decided the 4th shade was the one I meant all along. Walter never let me forget it. Every spring, when the light came in slanted in the mornings, he'd squint at that wall and say, "Still the wrong yellow." "Nora," and I'd throw a dish towel at him, and that little argument went on for 40 years and never once got old. We had David first, and 3 years later our daughter, Susan. Those years were loud and good. Walter built a long pine table for the dining room, sanded it smooth over a whole winter. And we ate Sunday supper at that table every week without fail. Pot roast in the cold months, sliced tomatoes from the garden in summer, the kids' elbows on the wood, and somebody always talking with their mouth full. On the 4th of July, Walter would be out at the smoker by 5 in the morning, and the whole place would smell like brisket and mesquite by noon. And half the neighborhood would drift over by supper time. I sewed Halloween costumes at the kitchen table by lamplight. I made David a Darth Vader costume out of cardboard boxes and black spray paint the year he was 7. And he loved it so much, he wore it to the grocery store and to church, and very nearly to bed. And I had to patch the cape with duct tape 3 separate times before November. And I'll tell you something about David as a boy, because it matters to how this ends. He was tender. When Susan was 4 and fell off her bike and split her chin, it was David, 8 years old, who carried her into the house hollering for me. His own knees scraped because he'd run the whole way without stopping. He was a good boy. I want you to hold on to that, because there is a version of this story where I tell you my son was always rotten, and that version would be easier, but it would be a lie. The hard truth is, you can raise a tender boy and still watch a grown man let cruelty happen in his own house, because looking away is easier than standing up. For a long time, things were as they should be. Susan moved to Ohio for a nursing job and married there, and her distance was honest distance miles, not coldness. We talked every Sunday. David stayed in Kerrville. He married Carol about 15 years ago, and they gave us our granddaughter, Hannah, who is 24 now and the gentlest soul in this whole family. Carol and I were never close, but we were fine. I want to be fair about her, because the truth is more complicated than I wanted it to be when I was standing on that porch. In the early years, she'd bring a pie to Sunday supper and stand in my kitchen complaining about her own mother, and I'd listen, and there was a real woman in there, tired and a little brittle, but not yet hard. People aren't born grasping. Something usually wears the kindness off them. With Carol, I think it was years of feeling like the one who did everything while everybody else got the credit. And I'd be lying if I said that resentment was entirely invented. But understanding why a person turns cold is not the same as letting them freeze you out of your own house. I learnt that the hard way. Then Walter got sick. It was his heart, then his kidneys, then everything at once, the way it goes sometimes. The last year of his life, he needed help around the clock. And that is when David and Carol offered to move in, just to lighten the load on you, Nora. I was grateful. I want you to understand that. I was 69, scared, watching my husband fade, and when my son said he'd be close by, it felt like a mercy. It did not stay a mercy for long, but it did not turn ugly all at once either, and that slow turning is the part that fooled me. The first thing I noticed was small. Carol started answering Walter's phone. Then she started answering the door. Then one afternoon I came back from the pharmacy, and my own kitchen had been reorganized, my pots in a low cabinet I could barely bend to reach, my mother's good dishes boxed up and carried to the garage. They were just collecting dust, she said. I figured you'd want the space. They were my mother's, I said. They're in the garage, Nora. They're fine. And then, softer, almost to herself, wiping down a counter that was already clean. Somebody around here has to keep this place running. There was a tiredness in it that was real. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She wasn't only scheming. She was also a worn-out woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that being indispensable gave her the right to take over. Both things were true at once. The pity I felt for her is exactly what kept me quiet too long. By spring, I had become a visitor in my own home. Carol scheduled Walter's appointments and forgot to tell me the times. When I asked the doctor a question, she'd answer for me, gently, with a hand on my arm. She gets confused, don't you, Nora? I did not get confused. I had kept the books for an entire elementary school for a quarter century without a penny out of place. But you say a thing in a soft, caring voice in front of enough nurses, and people start writing it down. That's the cruelty that hides inside concern. It doesn't look like cruelty, so you don't fight it, and by the time you see it for what it is, it's on paper. Here is the part I did not see until much later. While I was sitting at Walter's bedside holding his hand, Carol was sitting at his desk holding his pen. Keep that image in your mind, because it comes back. In those last months, Walter grew quiet in a way that wasn't only sickness. He'd watch Carol move through the house, and his jaw would tighten. One evening, when it was just the two of us and the oxygen machine humming, he gripped my wrist with what strength he had left. "Nora," he said, "promise me you'll check the workshop, the safe, June 9th. June 9th was our anniversary. The combination. Walter, hush, you need your rest. Promise me." His eyes were wet and urgent. "I'm worried. I don't know what they'll do. I don't know anything for sure. I'm just worried about you, and I want you taken care of." He did not say he had proof. He did not say he'd caught anyone. He said he was worried. the way a careful man worries when he has spent his whole life watching how easily a name can be lifted off a deed. I promised him. 3 weeks later, he was gone, in his chair by the window, with his coffee still warm on the sill. The funeral was on a Thursday. The church was full. People I hadn't seen in years pressed my hands and told me Walter was a good man. And he was. Carol stood at the front of the receiving line like she was hosting an event, accepting condolences on my behalf, steering folks along when they lingered too long with me. At the reception, I heard her in the church kitchen, not whispering quite low enough. Once the estate's settled, the house is really David's anyway. Walter always wanted it kept in the family. We just have to handle Nora gently. She's not herself right now. I set down my cup of punch, and I did not let my hand shake. 46 years of marriage teaches you how to hold still, and I remembered my promise. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, stay with me, because the morning of the funeral before any of that, I had already done the one thing that changed everything. That morning, before the cars came, while the house was full of people getting dressed, I slipped out the back to Walter's workshop. The safe sat under his old drafting table, where it had sat for 30 years, grey and dented and forgotten by everyone but me. I knelt down. My knees are not what they were, and I turned the dial. 6, 9, and the little handle gave. Inside was a manila envelope, soft at the corners from handling, and on the front, in Walter's blocky surveyor's print, it said, "Nora Reed first." I want to tell you I read it right then. I didn't have time. The cars were coming. I put the envelope in my purse, locked the safe, and went and buried my husband. But that envelope sat against my hip through the whole service, and I think it is the only thing that kept me standing upright. So now you understand the porch. 2 days after the funeral, I came back from staying the night at my friend Ruth's house. Carol had insisted I rest somewhere quiet, and I found the locks changed and my daughter-in-law watching me through the glass. What Carol did not know, what neither of them knew, was that the envelope was already in my purse, and the night before, at Ruth's kitchen table, I had finally read what was inside. Go ahead and subscribe if this is hitting close to home, because what Walter left me in that envelope is about to turn this whole story upside down. Inside were 4 things: a copy of a deed, a copy of a trust, a life insurance declaration page, and a letter, 2 pages, in Walter's hand. The deed showed that our house and the 4 acres were held not in Walter's name and not in mine, but in something called the Walter and Lenora Whitaker Family Trust, with the 2 of us as co-trustees. The trust document, Walter had clipped a yellow sticky note to the top that just said, "Read the part I circled," stated plainly that upon the death of either spouse, the survivor became sole trustee, with full and complete control of all trust property. The house was not David's. The house had never been David's. The house was mine, fully and legally, the moment Walter stopped breathing. The life insurance was a policy I half knew about, except the amount was $300,000, and the named beneficiary was me, payable directly, no probate, no committee, no Carol. And then the letter. I will not read you all of it, because some of it belongs only to me. But Walter wrote that in his last year he had grown worried, that was his word again. Worried watching how Carol moved our money around, and how David let her. He wrote that 2 months before, Carol had brought a man to the house she introduced as a friend who does paperwork, and that this man had laid a deed in front of Walter and asked him to sign the house over to David. For tax reasons, Dad. Walter said he told them he'd think on it. Then, the very next week, quiet as a man checking a property line, he drove to his lawyer and moved the house and the accounts into the trust where nobody could lift them off a single sheet of paper. I didn't accuse anybody, he wrote. I don't know for certain what they meant to do, and I'd hate to be wrong about my own boy. I just couldn't sleep until I knew you were safe. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I need you to be your smart self now Not your kind self. Call Paul Avery. He has everything. I sat at Ruth's table and I did not cry, which surprised me. I sat there for a long while, long enough for her stove clock to tick over, from 9:14 to a few minutes shy of 10, and somewhere in that quiet hour, the woman who had spent a year apologizing in her own home simply stopped existing. I did not feel rage. I felt something cooler and steadier than rage. I felt clear. I took out the little spiral notebook I keep in my purse, the cheap drugstore kind, and at the bottom of a fresh page I wrote one line: "A name on paper outlasts a voice in a kitchen." Then I closed it and slept better than I had in a year. So when Carol slid that window open and told me they'd changed the locks for my own good, I did not argue through the glass. I learned a long time ago you do not win an argument with someone who is counting on you to lose your composure. I just looked at her a moment. "Whose name do you think is on this house, Carol?" She smiled, that thin, tired smile. "Walter's, and now David's. We've talked to someone. You should sit down, Nora. We'll get you a nice apartment near the senior center, somewhere safe. Honestly, after everything I've done around here, you could thank me for thinking about you at all." There it was, the resentment showing through the concern, the "after everything I've done." In her mind, she'd earned this. That's what made her dangerous, and that's what made her almost pitiable, and I felt both at once. "That's kind of you," I said. "I'll be in touch." And I drove away. I want you to notice that I drove away. They expected me to pound on the door and weep, and when I didn't, Carol must have thought she'd won. She had no idea. I was driving straight to Paul Avery's office with a manila envelope in my purse. Paul had been Walter's lawyer for 30 years, and he greeted me with both hands and real grief because they had been friends. I laid the envelope on his desk. He didn't even open it. "I've got the originals in my vault, Nora," he said. "Walter sat right where you're sitting 14 months ago and put everything into that trust. The house is yours, free and clear, as trustee. There is no document on this earth that makes it your son's." "They changed the locks," I said. "I'm standing outside my own house." Paul's face went still in a way I'd never seen on him. "Then they've locked the legal owner out of her own property. That's not a family squabble. That's an unlawful lockout, and depending on how this goes, it can be a good deal more than that." He picked up a pen. "Let me ask you something, and I need you honest because it matters. During Walter's last year, did Carol have access to your accounts?" I thought of the reorganized kitchen, the phone she answered, the appointments I wasn't told. She had power of attorney for Walter, for his medical things. He signed it when he got too weak to drive. He wrote that down and underlined it twice. Medical or financial? "I don't know," I admitted. "I never read it. I trusted them." "We're going to find out," he said. "Right now, we secure your house. Here is the part I want every person listening to understand, because it is the part that matters most. I did not call the police and make a scene. I did not drive back and scream at my son. Paul drafted a letter, formal, certified, on his letterhead, informing David and Carol that Lenora Whitaker was the sole legal owner and trustee, that they were occupants with no ownership or lease, that changing the locks was unlawful, and that they were to restore my access within 72 hours or face removal. Certified mail, return receipt requested, so there would be a green card with a signature proving they got it. Walter used to say, "The most powerful thing in the world is a piece of paper somebody had to sign for." Then I waited. I am good at waiting. While I waited, I stayed at Ruth's and started a fresh page in my notebook, because Paul told me documentation wins cases and emotion loses them. I wrote down the funeral, the lockout, the time Carol spoke to me through the window, her exact words. "She's not herself, after everything I've done." I wrote it all in my plain bookkeeper's hand. That certified letter is what set the larger thing in motion, and I won't pretend it didn't get worse before it got better, because Carol did not hand over the keys. Carol did something I did not see coming. 4 days later, a sheriff's deputy found me at Ruth's and served me with papers. My own son had filed a petition in the county court for temporary guardianship of my person and my estate. It said I was an elderly widow in a state of grief and confusion, vulnerable to harmful decisions, in need of a guardian to protect her and her assets. Attached was a sworn statement from Carol describing how I forgot conversations, wandered the house at night, and could not be trusted with large sums of money. There was even a line from a nurse practitioner Carol had once taken me to, who'd written, "Patient appears mildly confused," after a visit where Carol answered every single question before I could open my mouth. I sat down on Ruth's couch and held those papers. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt afraid. The lockout was about a house. This was about me. If a court declared me incompetent, they wouldn't just get the house. They'd get the right to manage my money, my medical care, where I lived, what I was even allowed to decide. They would not be stealing from me anymore. They would own me. Ruth sat beside me. "What are you going to do, Nora?" And here is what a year of expensive lessons had taught me. "I'm going to do exactly what Walter told me," I said. "I'm going to be my smart self." Then I called Paul, and I did not let my voice shake. Paul was angrier than I'd ever heard him, but it was a cold, useful anger. "They've overplayed it," he said. "Guardianship is a serious accusation, and it cuts both ways. To prove you need a guardian, they have to put your competence on trial, which means we get to put their conduct on trial too. Nora, 3 things this week. Tell me." First, an independent geriatric physician board certified, no connection to Carol for a full cognitive evaluation, in writing, signed and dated. Second, every record you can lay hands on, bank statements, that power of attorney Walter signed, all of it. Third, he paused. Keep writing everything down, in your own hand, with dates. A confused woman cannot keep a clean ledger. Your notebook may be your best witness in that courtroom. I almost laughed. I'd been keeping that notebook for years. The evaluation took 2 hours. Memory, reasoning, judgment, counting backward, drawing a clock. At the end, the doctor, a kind woman, about my Susan's age, set down her pen and looked at me over her glasses. "Lenora Whitaker," she said, "I have to ask, because I see this more than you'd think. Is someone trying to take control of your affairs?" "My son's wife," I said. She nodded slowly. "The way you nod when a thing you've seen too many times walks in your door again. Your scores are excellent, above average for any age. I'll write that down plainly, date it, and state, in my professional opinion, that you are fully capable of managing your own life and decisions. I'll testify to it if it comes to that." She paused. "Keep your notebook. People like your daughter-in-law count on the rest of us, assuming an old woman can't keep her own records." That letter went into Paul's file the same afternoon, but the part that broke the whole thing open was the bank records. When Paul subpoenaed the accounts carefully, legally, every step on paper, we found out what Carol had been doing while I held Walter's hand. The power of attorney Walter signed when he got weak was not just medical. Carol had it written as a financial power of attorney too, and Walter, sick and trusting, had signed where the little tabs pointed. Over the last 10 months of his life, Carol had used that authority to move $41,000 out of his personal account into a new account in her own name, in amounts small enough that nobody glanced twice. Checks made out to cash. A payment to the very man from Walter's letter, the friend who does paperwork for deed preparation services, dated the same week. They'd put that unsigned transfer in front of Walter. That was the deed Walter refused to sign, the one that would have made the house David's. They had paid for it, and Walter had quietly checkmated it by moving the house into the trust where their paperwork couldn't reach. He hadn't predicted exactly what they'd try. He'd just been worried enough to lock the door behind him. I sat in Paul's office, looking at that pile of statements, and the last of my grief turned into something I could use. I opened my notebook and wrote, "They counted on me not knowing how to count." "Nora," Paul said gently, "this is no longer just civil. Misusing a financial power of attorney to enrich yourself is elder financial exploitation. In Texas, that can be reported, investigated, and prosecuted. You have a decision about how far to take this." I want to tell you I sat with that decision, and I did. I waited 2 days, because Walter always said, never make a permanent choice in a temporary feeling. I thought about David in that cardboard Darth Vader cape, carrying his little sister into the house with his own knees bleeding. I thought about Hannah, my granddaughter, who had nothing to do with any of this and had texted me every single day since the funeral, the only one who did. And I thought about Carol standing in my kitchen, tired and certain she'd earned the right to throw me out. When I went back to Paul, I had my answer, and it was not the one Carol expected. People who do what she did always expect you to collapse or explode. I did neither. "Here's what we do," I told him. "We answer the guardianship with the doctor's letter and my records, and we get it thrown out. We recover the 41,000, every penny, with interest. We send a proper legal eviction, the lawful kind, with the right notice, because they're occupants, and I'm the owner, and I want them out cleanly so no one can ever say I did it wrong. And then I want the power of attorney misuse reported to Adult Protective Services and the county, not for revenge, for the record. So the next old person Carol gets her hands on has a file with her name already in it." Paul looked at me a long moment. "Walter," he said quietly, "would be proud of you." "Walter did the hard part," I said. "He left me the paper. I'm just signing my name where mine belongs." It moved quickly after that. The way things move when you finally have all your documents in a row and the other side has nothing but raised voices. The guardianship petition collapsed, almost the moment the judge read the independent doctor's letter and saw the bank records Paul attached. A woman who keeps a dated ledger of her own affairs and scores above average on a cognitive exam is not a woman who needs a guardian. The judge, a sharp, older man who'd seen this play before, dismissed it from the bench and did not hide what he thought of the people who filed it. I sat very still and did not gloat. I folded my hands in my lap, the way I had at the funeral, and let the paper talk. The eviction was cleaner than I expected, because by then their own lawyer had told them what Paul had been telling me all along. The house was in the trust. The trust made me sole owner. They had no lease and no claim, and a $41,000 problem of their own. They moved out within the notice period. I did not watch them go. Hannah called to tell me, and she was crying. "Grandma, I'm so sorry," she said. "I didn't know what Mom was doing. I swear I didn't." "I know you didn't, sweetheart," I said. "You're the only one who texted me." The day they were gone, I drove out with Paul's locksmith and had every lock changed back, and the man handed me a single bright new key. I stood in my own kitchen for the first time in a week. My mother's dishes were still boxed in the garage. I carried every box back inside myself, one at a time, and put them up high where I could see them, against that wrong yellow wall Walter teased me about for 40 years. The 41,000 came back over the following months, through Carol's attorney, in a settlement that also required them to formally withdraw any claim to the estate, signed and notarized, so it could never be raised again. The report to Adult Protective Services went in too. I don't know what came of it on their end, and I've made my peace with not knowing. I didn't do it to watch anyone suffer. I did it because Walter spent his whole life making sure names were written correctly on pieces of paper, and I would not let the last name they wrote falsely stand. Then I did the thing that mattered most. I went back to Paul and rewrote my own estate, calmly, clear-headed, over a cup of his terrible office coffee. I did not cut my whole family out in a fit of anger. That isn't who I am, and Walter didn't marry a spiteful woman. But I will not be anyone's retirement plan either. My daughter Susan, who was honest about her distance and never once pretended to love me for my money, stayed in my plans, fairly. David, I did not erase, but he no longer inherits the house or the bulk of anything, and what he might receive comes with the kind of conditions a person earns back over years. Not weekends. Carol receives nothing, ever, and I named that plainly, because vagueness is how people like her find a foothold. And I set up a trust for my grandchildren, all of them, equally. No favourites held until they turn 30, so no parent can pressure a child into handing it over. I named Hannah as the successor trustee, not the one who gets the most, but the one trusted, when I'm gone, to administer it honestly for the others. I chose her not because I love her more, but because in the worst week of my life, she was the one who showed up. Showing up is the only currency I trust anymore. When we finished, I opened my notebook and wrote, I did not disinherit my family. I stopped pretending presence and absence are the same thing. Now let me tell you about the life I have, because the documents were never the point. The documents were just the lock on the door. What's behind the door is what matters. I live in my own house. I have coffee on the back porch every morning where Walter drank his, and I watch the deer come up through the cedar at dusk. I joined a quilting circle at the Methodist Church on Wednesdays, and a woman named Dot, 78, and outspoken as a rooster, has become one of the best friends I've ever had. I volunteer 2 mornings a week at the literacy centre downtown, and there is a kind of holiness in watching a grown man read a street sign out loud, for the first time, that I cannot explain to you. I cook too much and carry the extra to Ruth. I learned to drive into Fredericksburg by myself for the peach stands, which Walter and I always meant to do and never did. Hannah comes for supper most Sundays. We eat at Walter's long pine table, and she doesn't ask me for a thing. Once she said, Grandma, I feel like I should apologize for my whole family. And I told her, you are not your mother, and you never have to apologize for being kind to me. Susan flew down from Ohio last fall, and we drove the hill country with the windows down, and talked more in 7 days than we had in 7 years. David called me, finally, about 6 months after they moved out. Not Carol, David. His voice was small. Mom, he said, I didn't know everything she was doing. Some of it I didn't know. Some of it, I said. A long silence. Some of it I did, he admitted, and I'll give him this, at least he didn't lie to me twice. I let it happen because it was easier. I kept telling myself she was just being practical, that you were getting older, that she was handling it. It was easier to believe her than to look at it straight. His voice cracked. I was a coward, Mom. Dad would have been ashamed of me. That was the first true thing my son had said to me in a year, and I won't pretend it didn't reach in and find the boy who carried his sister up the porch steps. But forgiveness that arrives that fast isn't worth the breath it's said with, and we both knew it. I hear you, David, I said, and I'm glad you can finally say it. If you want to find your way back to me, the door is open. But it's a door now, with a lock and a key that's mine. You come through it by showing up week after week, asking for nothing. That's the only way in. Words are cheap, son. I've had a year of very expensive lessons in exactly how cheap they are. He's been trying. I'll say that much, and it should be slow. Because slow is how you tell the difference between a man who's sorry and a man who's only been caught. He comes by some Sundays now and fixes things around the house that don't really need fixing. And he doesn't talk about money. And he doesn't bring Carol, who he is no longer married to as of this spring, though that's his story to tell, not mine. The relationship I'll have with my son for whatever years I've got left is being rebuilt, one honest Sunday at a time, and I am no longer the one carrying its whole weight. That alone has added years to my life. People ask me sometimes. Ruth asks. Dot asks whether I'm angry. whether I lie awake hating Carol for what they tried to do in the worst week of my life. The honest answer is no, not anymore. I was angry, and I had every right to be. But I learned something, kneeling in front of Walter's safe, with the funeral cars coming up the drive. The people who underestimate you are handing you your power. They thought I was a confused old widow who'd sign whatever was put in front of her. They never once considered that the woman who kept a school's books for 26 years, married to a man who measured the truth in property lines, might know exactly how to read a deed. I did not win, because I shouted louder. I never raised my voice, not on the porch, not in the courtroom, not on the phone. Sometimes dignity does not arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a certified letter, in a doctor's signature, in a notebook kept in a plain hand, in a single new key cut for a lock that is finally, truly, only yours. Last night I sat at Walter's table after Hannah went home, and I read back through all of it, the funeral, the dead key, the long, quiet hour at Ruth's. The $41,000, the courtroom, the boxes of my mother's dishes, carried back inside one at a time. And, on a clean page at the very end, I wrote the only line that mattered, the one I think Walter would have liked best. They locked the door to keep me out. They forgot I was the one who built the house. Then I closed the notebook, turned off the porch light, and went to bed in my own home. And I slept like a woman with nothing left to prove.